I'd like to welcome you all to this session entitled Justice and St. Thomas Aquinas. We have a very impressive panel of scholars here, so this promises to be very, very enlightening. I'll introduce the speaker. They'll talk for about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. Okay, our first speaker is Professor Jean Porter. Professor Porter is the John A. O'Brien Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. Professor Porter received her B.A. from the University of Texas, her M.Div. from the Weston School of Theology, her M.A. and Ph.D. from Yale University. Professor Porter's research interests lie primarily in the areas of foundational moral theology and the history of Christian moral thought, especially in the scholastic period. Her most recent publications include Nature as Reason, a Thomistic Theory of Natural Law, and Natural and Divine Law, Reclaiming the Tradition for Christian Ethics. She has written 2 other books and more than 30 scholarly articles. In 2005, Professor Porter was president of the Society of Christian Ethics, and in 1997 received a Luce Fellowship in Theology. She currently serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Religious Ethics and Studies in Christian Ethics, and is currently working on a theory of positive law based on the theory of natural law developed in her most recent book. Professor Porter.
Ryan, thank you very much. I cannot resist adding that I am no longer working on a theory of positive law. It has now been published. The book is Ministers of the Law, and to quote a speaker from the last panel I heard, I hope you all go out and buy it. I am currently working on a book with the same title as my paper this afternoon, Justice is a Virtue. Now, I realize that makes your heart sink, but I have been very careful to keep my remarks relatively brief. And so I'll turn to my comments. According to Aquinas, justice is a virtue, which he defines, following Justinian's Digest, as a constant and perpetual will, rendering to each that which is his right. The claim that justice is most fundamentally a personal virtue, rather than a set of abstract rules taken in themselves or institutional arrangements, has not received the attention that it deserves, even from Aquinas' most sympathetic commentators. Yet this claim is fundamental for his account of what justice is and why it matters. Given Aquinas' overall theory of the virtues, his definition implies that justice is a perfection. That is to say, a full and appropriate development of a natural capacity of the human soul. More specifically, justice is an habitus, that is, a staple disposition of the rational appetite, the will. I think this is an interesting and morally fruitful idea, and I'd like to take this opportunity to explain, necessarily briefly, why I think it is worth pursuing. Let me preface what I'm about to say with a couple of comments about what this does not mean for Aquinas. Just to address what I think in our own context would be some very natural misunderstandings. First, Aquinas' emphasis on justice as a virtue does not imply for him that we can do without moral rules. I'm not going to go into the details here, but Aquinas' analysis of the virtues in general, and of justice especially, is set up in such a way that the virtues are correlated, both with the object, that is the kind of act they produce, and you take an object of an act, flip it around, and you have a rule. But then he also sets it up in the secunda secundae in such a way that all the virtues are correlated with precepts. So we can't claim, as some of our contemporaries would do, that justice is simply a matter of the contextualized judgment of the really good person. Aquinas thinks that rules do matter here, and they stand in a reciprocal relation with the stance that constitutes the virtue of justice. Secondly, and correlatively, Aquinas insists that justice is a matter of objective right relations between people, and that it matters to get these right. I think this point is worth some emphasis because, I think especially we theologians, when we talk about justice, move very quickly to talk about justice and, justice and love, justice and humility, justice and the kingdom of God, justice and whatever. Aquinas is for all those things, okay? But Aquinas is very keen on getting justice. You get justice secured, and then you worry about the justice and part. Now, this doesn't mean he thinks that justice as a virtue is unimportant by any means, but he does also think that it is possible to secure right relations between people in all sorts of ways and for all sorts of motives, and that it critically matters for the sake of the people involved that we do that. And I think it's important not to lose sight of that. So much for what this does not mean. Now, let's look at what it does mean for Aquinas, to say that justice is a virtue, that is to say, a perfection. Well, if justice is a perfection of the will, it follows that the virtue represents a development of something in the will's innate structure as an appetite of a certain kind. As I suspect most of you know already, the will, as Aquinas understands it, is naturally oriented towards the rational good. That is to say, to the good understood abstractly and conceptually. This might suggest that justice simply is a right orientation towards the good abstractly or universally considered, but I think this pretty clearly is not what Aquinas means. It's important to remember that the will is innately oriented towards a particular good, namely the agent's own good, understood, however, in a conceptual and abstract way. Thus, a right orientation towards good in the abstract does not count as a perfection of the will. Moreover, Aquinas, in contrast to many of his interlocutors, including Albert the Great, some of his other immediate predecessors, rejects a view that justice in any sense should be understood in terms of a right orientation towards the moral good, such as we would associate with general moral rectitude. Even general justice, so-called, is a particular virtue, paradoxical though I know that sounds, directed towards the common good of the civic community as its proper object. What is more, the will is innately oriented towards the agent's own comprehensive good, and therefore, in contrast to the passions, it does not need the formation of the virtues in order to direct its inclinations to the overall well-being of the agent. At the same time, the passions, for this very reason, offer us an instructive point of comparison. Their characteristic virtues, primarily temperance and fortitude, direct desires and aversions in such a way as to reflect the overall good of the human agent, rather than attaching to what is ever immediately attractive or repellent. In other words, these virtues, so to say, contextualize and ratchet up the passions so that they get oriented in the right way. In much the same way, the will, which is innately and naturally oriented towards the agent's own good, needs its characteristic virtues, including justice, to orient itself in the right way to goods which go beyond the self. Again, taking it to the next level and contextualizing it. And this observation suggests a more promising way to get at an account of justice as a perfection of the will. We've just observed that Aquinas does identify a kind of justice which orients the real rightly towards a more comprehensive good, namely general or legal justice, which is directed to the common good. Aquinas clearly regards this as a perfection. As he says more than once, the individual stands in relation to the political community as part to whole, and therefore a well-disposed individual will love the common good more than his own individual good. Nor is this orientation inconsistent with the agent's orientation towards happiness, since he cannot attain his own comprehensive good unless he is in right relation to his community. Now, people, let's be honest. There is something a little bit disquieting about this particular way of understanding the perfection of the individual vis-a-vis the community. And the truth is, Aquinas himself seems to have had second thoughts about it, or at least to have wanted to qualify it in different ways. If we move from the prima pars into the secunda pars, we find Aquinas specifying his claims for the supremacy of the common good in such a way as to make it clear that right relations between community and individual are reciprocal and presuppose constraints on both sides. There are certain kinds of harms which can never be inflicted on innocent men and women, even for the sake of the overall well-being of the community. Moreover, individuals have claims to sustenance and fair treatment, which taken together imply that each individual has a claim to some share in the commonwealth of the community, and no one can be asked to bear a disproportionate share of its burdens. The supremacy of the common good, thus understood, presupposes a community that sustains right relations, equity, and some independence on the part of its individual members. And when these ideals are compromised, the common good as an ideal and as a basis for claims on the community is undermined or might even dissolve. We began by asking how justice perfects the will. And at one point, Aquinas replies that it does so by directing the agent's innate orientation towards his own perfection outwards towards the common good. But we've seen that Aquinas qualifies this, and it is by no means all he has to say on the subject. This is apparent when we turn to his extended discussion, comprising over 60 questions of the Secunda Secundae, of the actual content of the normative ideal of justice. As we work through these questions, we find that the common good and the claims of the community actually get very little attention. And clearly they do not play the central structuring role that we might expect. Aquinas does comment on the grounds and the scope of political authority, but practically these remarks in this context are almost always brought back to the claims and duties held by those in positions of authority, and what they can do as representatives of the community that private individuals cannot. To a very considerable extent, Aquinas discusses the private individual's communal obligations in connection with other virtues, particularly fortitude and charity, where we find his fullest discussions of the obligations of courage and the duties of combatants in wartime. What we do find in Aquinas' analysis of justice is an extended treatment, comprising at this point almost everything he has to say about the virtue, of the claims and obligations that individuals owe one another. In other words, his analysis here is focused almost entirely on what he calls particular justice, which pertains to the claims of individuals. Claims on representatives of the community, in the case of distributive justice, or on individuals vis-a-vis one another, in the case of commutative justice. More specifically still, his discussion of the precepts of justice focuses almost entirely on commutative justice, which he brings back to all the norms of non-maleficence and special obligation traditionally associated with the Decalogue. Even when he speaks of justice broadly considered, he analyzes the virtue in such a way as to underscore the centrality of individual claims and obligations. Recall once again the definition of justice with which we began. The object of justice, he says, is the use, the right. Now, throughout the period we're considering, scholastics regarded this as a juridical concept, grounded in, although not limited to, the practices of law courts. Jura, or rights, are claims which individuals or corporate entities can lodge on the basis of natural relations, customs, agreements, or enacted laws. And when we turn to Aquinas' own analysis of use as the object of justice, this is exactly the way in which he analyzes it, in the traditional categories of natural and positive right. What is more, he takes his initial paradigms for just actions from judicial contexts. The primary act of justice, he says, is judicium, judgment, explicitly said to be the act of a judge. And his initial analysis of duties and transgressions of justice is situated in the context of the courtroom. Of course, Aquinas realizes that we also have duties and claims outside judicial contexts. But even these tend to be framed in terms that are strongly reminiscent of legal language, suggesting once again that the paradigms set by legal practice are playing a central role in his thought here. What is going on here? Well, I think we get a cue to this when we turn to his analysis of the virtue of justice as such, which is, of course, the Secunda Secundae 58. I shouldn't say, of course, I have it written down, but that's what it is. I don't have this all memorized, okay? Which confirms the centrality of individual relations for his overall conception of justice. In this question, Aquinas does have something to say about the way in which this virtue perfects the will. But that is not what we might initially have expected him to say. That is, in this question, Aquinas focuses on the will as the principle of external acts, through which the individual enters into relations with others and with the community taken as a whole. Justice perfects the will by disposing it to right actions, that is to say, actions which observe a real mean between individuals, thus creating or preserving right relations. Seen from this perspective, the aspect of the will that justice immediately perfects is its relation to human acts, and more specifically, its quality as the capacity through which the agent governs herself and places herself in relationships with others. The will is the principle of human autonomy on our terms, and as such it provides justification and criteria for the activities to which we hold ourselves accountable to one another, activities which are essential to any form of human life. Seen from one perspective, this might seem to suggest a disturbingly thin ideal of justice. After all, a settled disposition to observe the norms of justice need not reflect any sense that these are valuable in themselves, or any regard for the individuals whose claims press in on the agent. We can readily imagine a timid psychopath who would gladly undertake a life of crime if she thought she could get away with it, but who figures that all things considered, honesty really is the best policy. I don't think this is what Aquinas means. It is true that justice is most fundamentally a perfection of the will as expressed through free judgment and choice. It is also the case that particular acts attain or fall short of an ideal of justice in virtue of their conformity to objective standards of equity and fair exchange. Nonetheless, our acts in relation to one another are important precisely because they express and sustain relations of a certain kind. Our relationships are mediated through objective structures of right relations. That is Aquinas' key insight, I think, in his analysis of justice, and I think it is a timely and important insight. But ultimately, our relationships cannot express and sustain ideals and commitments that we don't really have, unless we really do care about justice as an ideal and about those whose claims are mediated to us through this ideal. Our relations with one another, correct though they may be at any one moment, will not promote the attainment and safeguarding of justice in the long run, nor will they foster the kind of humane society that we need and crave. And so in conclusion, I would simply say that Aquinas' analysis of justice is remarkable for a couple of reasons. One is the way in which he grounds the virtue carefully and squarely in his overall philosophical and theological system and the detailed philosophical psychology that he works out. The strength that this gives him and the normative power that it gives him in dealing with the images and ideals of justice in his own day. And I think finally he's important for the way in which he holds together the perhaps paradoxical tension between, on the one hand, affirming the objective claims of justice and the critical value in getting these right, but on the other hand, the importance of bringing to these a heart and a mind and a will, which is oriented towards perpetually rendering to one another that which is his or her due. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Father Kevin Flannery. Father Flannery is a professor of the history of ancient philosophy at the Pontifical Gregorian University and former dean of the Faculty of Philosophy at the Pontifical Gregorian University. His research focuses primarily on the ethics of Aristotle, with special emphasis on action theory, ancient logic, and the ethics of Thomas Aquinas. From 2006 to 2007, he was the Marianne Remick Senior Visiting Fellow at the University of Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. Since 2002, he has been a consultor to the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. An Ohio native, he received his BA in English Literature from Ohio State University. He received an MA in Anglo-Irish Studies from University College Dublin and an MA in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics from the University of Oxford. Father Flannery received a Master's of Divinity and a license in Sacred Theology Patristics from Weston School of Theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He received a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Oxford. Please welcome Father Flannery.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for that kind introduction. I have a paper here which I wrote a long paper. It's a paper about 30, 40 pages long, and obviously I can't read that here, but what I'd like to do is simply summarize what I say there. And it's a fairly technical paper, and basically in it, what I try to do is say what I think Aristotle is saying in the fifth book of the Ethics, which is about justice, connecting this also with what Thomas Aquinas says about that same book. What I'll do here is simply read bits of that larger essay, but basically what I'll be doing is describing in outline what I say there. And I also hope to, in fact I will, connect the arguments found in Aristotle, also Thomas, with some of the things that we've heard already in the conference, especially things said last night by Professors Sandel and George. In Aquinas' Moral, Political, and Legal Theory, written by John Finnis, whom I see in the audience, John Finnis says that Aquinas' efforts to follow Aristotle in classifying types of justice, its species, parts, and associated forms, yields no really clear and stable analytical pattern. That's a quotation. He attributes this instability to Thomas's, and again I quote, adherence to Aristotle's framework for discussing justice in Book 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics, and to the structure of the Summa Theologiae, which, as he notes, looks to the virtues rather than to what reason requires and what acts are consistent with pursuing human goods and avoiding evil. The present essay makes no attempt to go against, to refute this general claim of John's, which involves many and disparate texts in the Thomistic corpus, also in Aristotle, obviously. It attempts rather simply to show that Aristotle's theory of justice makes good sense and captures fundamental truths regarding justice, and that Thomas's reading of Nicomachean Ethics 5, I'll just refer to that as Book 5, helps to bring these truths into relief. If it is true that Thomas's interpretation, found in his commentary on the Ethics and in questions 57 to 61 of the Secunda Secundae of the Summa, smooths out some of the rough spots in Aristotle's presentation of the theory, it does so in a way that identifies the deeper principles of the theory. At least that's my thesis. This leaves us, I think, with a stable theoretical basis for interpreting Aristotle's very complex theory of justice. That's one of my theses in the larger paper, is simply that justice is complex, according to Aristotle. The essay to which I'm referring considers primarily the distinctions set out in the first 5 chapters of Book 5. That is, the division of justice itself into general and particular justice, already mentioned, and the further division of particular justice into distributive justice and what Aristotle appears to call corrective justice, but which Thomas calls commutative justice. It does not consider, that is my essay, or rather it considers only briefly, some philosophically important distinctions that Aristotle makes in the remaining 6 chapters of the book, such as the distinction between political justice and other analogous forms of justice, such as domestic and paternal justice, and it doesn't consider the important distinction between political and natural justice, which Aristotle introduces. The essay argues that general justice for both Thomas and Aristotle is primarily a virtue of the lawmaker, and that therefore general justice's scope is limited by its object, the establishment of laws. It argues similarly that the analysis of distributive justice, in certain regards, looks primarily not to the normally civil authority that makes the distribution, but to those to whom the distribution is made. Finally, it sets out some reasons why we should, or at least could, follow Thomas in reading chapters 4 and 5 of Book 5, as a unit in which Aristotle sets out his understanding of a single type of justice, that is, Thomas's commutative justice. Although the term itself would suggest otherwise, the term general justice pertains in a particular, that is, in a non-general way, to the political man or the lawmaker. Thomas explains that it is called general because it orders towards the common good, but it still involves a specific task, that of the lawmaker. It is general because it makes use of all ethics, as Aristotle says, but it applies what it thus knows to laws in lawmaking. As we learn near the beginning of the first book of the Ethics, the task of the master science politics, that is lawmaking, is to determine which of the other disciplines shall be learned in the city, in the polis, up to what point they shall be learned, and by whom, and to determine by legislation, and I quote, what one must do and what one must refrain from doing, end of quotation. This certainly sounds to us as if Aristotle advocates government of the most obtrusive sort. And there would certainly be aspects of an Aristotelian sanctioned regime that we would find unduly interfering with our personal freedom. He maintains, for instance, that legislation might encourage not only abortion, but even infanticide. But however intrusive such legislation might be, it is certainly not big government intrusiveness. Aristotle's remarks have to do with the city, the polis, the population of which, he says, cannot reach 100,000 without ceasing to be a city. And he was strongly in favor of allowing these smaller political entities to determine their own laws, as is apparent throughout the politics. So my point in this part of the paper is basically that general justice is a species of justice within the genus of justice itself. And the other species, or at least another species within that genus, is particular justice. So as a consequence, we can't say that particular justice is a species within general justice. What this approach, in effect, does is to preserve the independent intelligibility of what the lawmaker does, his vocation, so to speak, as distinct from the intelligibility of what the individual citizen does when he deals with his neighbor in matters where he could get the upper hand, but will not if he is just. If it were true that particular justice was a species of the genus general justice, when you pay a just price for your neighbor's old wheelbarrow, for instance, you would somehow be participating in what the lawmaker does in the legislature as he brings into effect a law regulating commerce. This is not a merely logical point about genera and species, but one that has practical significance. In setting out these ideas, Aristotle certainly has in mind the ideal city of Plato's Republic, which he regards as inadequate precisely because it conceives of the city's macrostructure, overseen by the lawmaker or lawmakers, as identical qua structure to the microstructures within it, households and marriages, for instance, and even the individual soul, according to Plato. The only difference being that the macrostructure comprises more individuals than the microstructures. Such an approach lends itself to totalitarianism, according to Aristotle, because for a lawmaker to reach down into the lower levels of the macrostructure would simply be for him, in this Platonic system, for him to reach down into a smaller sector of the very structure for which he is responsible. He would be doing his proper task. But that's not, as I say, the position of Aristotle. Although Aristotle clearly recognizes a connection between the city as a whole and the institutions within it, he recognizes too that the vocation of the lawmaker is quite different, even structurally, from the vocation, for instance, of the master of a household, that is, of a husband, a father, and a slave owner. The proper object of the lawmaker's activity is laws and has nothing directly to do with, for instance, families. In the Republic, Plato's Socrates would abolish the family, at least for the guardians of the city, and the institution of marriage. Women would be shared, on the grounds that this will make the city more unified. In reaction, Aristotle says, and I quote, "Is it not obvious that a state may at length attain such a degree of unity as to be no longer a state?" So I move on now to particular justice. To add to the complexity, Aristotle identifies within particular justice two other types of justice: distributive justice and what he calls, at least sometimes, corrective justice. There is some controversy, which we'll deal with later, about this latter term, especially for Thomas, since Thomas speaks rather, as I've already suggested, of distributive and commutative justice. In any case, the special mark of distributive justice, according to Aristotle, is the involvement of what he calls geometrical proportion, as opposed to arithmetical proportion, which we'll look at soon. Unlike arithmetical proportion, geometrical proportion is not a matter simply of counting things up. It uses numbers, but is not directly about quantities. Rather, it is about proportions themselves. Distributive justice is about both persons and things. Since the relative qualities of persons are not commensurable in a straightforward or arithmetical way, either among themselves, that is, persons among themselves, or with commensurable things, geometrical proportion is ideally suited to the task of determining what is a just distribution. The just distributor, exercising general justice, since his object is the common good, at least usually, determines, for reasons that correspond to distributive justice, that Mr. A deserves a larger share of the common goods than does Mr. B. Let us say that that to Mr. A's dessert can be assigned the number 6, and to Mr. B's dessert the number 12. In assigning these numbers, the distributor is not counting anything up, but he's simply ordering the relevant factors. This is certainly not counting things up when he assigns numbers to persons. And let us say, too, that the common goods in question are 12 in number. These, by contrast, are commensurate, at least among themselves, as in 12 coins. The distributor acts justly if he gives 4 of these things to Mr. A and 8 of these to Mr. B, according to the proportion I wrote on the board there. Since the two proportions, 4 to 6 and 8 to 12, are equal. As 4 is to 6, so 8 is to 2. The proportions, 2 to 3 in each case, are equal. The distribution is geometrically proportional. Actually, this is what Aristotle says, but my thesis here in the paper is that it's not so much, the geometrical proportion is not, strictly speaking, the most important thing here. The most important thing for our purposes I think, is the fact that, that the distributor determines in a way which has nothing to do with counting things up, that certain types of people should be put in a certain order. And in other words, that some things, and this is very connected with what Professor Sandel and George were saying last night, that some things are simply not commensurable. We simply can't assign a numerical number to them, or at least at base they are not numerical, and any sort of such assignments are really depending on other moral principles. But we'll also see that Aristotle really gets quite practical about how these are to be applied. Recognizing that general and distributive justice are distinct types of justice is to recognize in another way that there are limits upon general justice. It is just by way of general justice that persons put in charge of the common good issue decrees in order to promote the common good. To a certain extent, they create justice. What a decree specifies is, in a certain sense, just, simply because someone with authority has issued the decree. But when a law has to do with the distribution of goods, the person entrusted with general justice must respect distributive justice. If they do not, if, for instance, their ordering of individuals in the city is not according to genuine merit, but, let's say, according to monies received by the distributor, they have abused the authority they have in general justice by failing to respect distributive justice. Since merit is not subject to strict commensuration, persons holding office in general enjoy the benefit of doubt in distribution. But that benefit has its limits. At a certain point, it becomes obvious that a particular distribution is not just. And here comes to mind many of the things that Alistair MacIntyre said yesterday, simply about how we come to decisions about what is just and what is not. It often has to do with traditions, and we grow in our knowledge of what is just, what is a just distribution. Let me just mention, because the time's kind of running out here, but arithmetical proportion, which is proper rather to corrective justice, or actually commutative justice in Thomas. Arithmetical proportion, which is characteristic especially of corrective justice, has solely to do with things that are commensurable. Aristotle gives the example of a judge applying corrective justice as follows, and I quote, "The judge restores equality. If it is as if there were a line divided into unequal parts, and he should take away that by which the greater segment exceeds the half of the line and adds it to the smaller segments." That's the quotation. Suppose, for instance, that at the starting position both Mr. A and B have three things, and that this is just. There's equality. If Mr. A takes one thing from Mr. B, he will have four, and Mr. B will obviously have two. In order to restore justice or equality, the judge takes the one thing, and gives it back to Mr. B. Takes the one thing from Mr. A, gives it to B. And then at this point, they once again have three things, so equality is established. Arithmetical proportion can be more complicated than this, but this example offered by Aristotle serves well the purpose of showing that arithmetical proportion is more straightforward than geometrical proportion. And we noted previously that geometrical proportion is not about commensurable objects, but about proportions. Okay, arithmetical proportion is about commensurable objects, although sometimes they are only commensurable given a previous application of distributive justice. Let me just summarize what I go on to say, is that there are a lot of textual problems in what Thomas says about Book 5, and I just want to point out a couple of things that he says. One thing, when he talks about distributive justice, he's very insistent, much more clearly insistent than Aristotle is, that distributive justice is about the individual, and that distributive justice is something that is affected in the individuals in the city, and although it's an act which is performed by, for instance, not always a politician. And in any case, the argument is that there's a great burden on the person who distributes in order to be distributively just. It's also important, and this is a point which I very much agree with John Finnis on, is that people have often interpreted general justice as assigning a very, very prominent role to central governments. And that's not at all consistent with what Aristotle says or with what Thomas says. Certainly there is some role for government, for central government, but distributive justice can occur in the family, for instance, or in any sort of smaller organization. There's also an interpretive problem, which I mentioned earlier, about chapters 4 and 5, and where Thomas very much wants to identify or speak of just one type of justice, and Aristotle appears to think that there are two. And I think that that problem can be solved by looking at the way that Thomas uses both distributive and arithmetical proportion. And what happens is that he begins by talking about a geometrical proportion and just turns it into a straight case of assigning arithmetic proportion. So when we get into the marketplace, when we get into concrete applications of justice, it becomes a matter of arithmetical proportion or commutative justice. If I could just read one last paragraph first. In any case, this, I think, is an acknowledgement on Aristotle's and Thomas's part that the moral, not commensurable decisions made in distributive justice will eventually find their way into law as statements about the relationship of commensurable things. As Thomas says in a quotation which is in the paper, required in the end is always equality of thing to thing. So in the end, we do at least maintain the fiction of there being commensuration. But this does not mean that a society might not go back and question whether the decisions made in distributive justice were correctly made, or whether, for instance, solutions arrived in distributive justice with respect to certain things might not work, might not represent true distributive justice with respect to other things. Incentives, for instance, might be appropriate in order to promote charitable giving, but not in order to promote organ donations. These are some of the issues that were discussed last night. All this is to remember that justice is not only complex, but that it is truly a virtue, as Professor Porter was saying, requiring characters capable of discerning such differences and acting upon them in politics and in all areas of human life. Thank you very much.
Our final speaker is Professor Anna Moreland. Professor Moreland is an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities at Villanova University. She received her BA in philosophy at the University of Maryland, College Park, and her MA and PhD in systematic theology from Boston College. Her areas of research include faith and reason, medieval theology with an emphasis on Thomas Aquinas, the rise of modern atheism, and the theology of religious pluralism. Her first book is entitled Known by Nature, Thomas Aquinas on Natural Knowledge of God. She's currently working on her second book, What's Reason Got to Do with It? Theologies of Religious Pluralism. Please welcome Professor Moreland.
Good afternoon. I realize that I am the one thing standing between you and the end of a long day listening to academic papers. So I'm not very funny. I can't promise to be funny, but I'll be brief. So it's the one promise I can make at the beginning. And I also have to admit that I'm a systematic theologian, so I am more comfortable in those parts of the Summa that fill out the hard work that is morality. So I'll be talking only about the potential part of justice, religion. I want to suggest that resurrecting Thomas's account of religion could help clarify vexing issues in interreligious inquiry. Now, I'll admit from the outset, this has to be very clear, that I'm taking Thomas to places he would not have gone in the 13th century. But I think I do this with a genuine Thomistic spirit, and you will have to be the judges of my success. First, I will offer a brief outline of Thomas's account of religion. Next, I will point to the ways in which this account has been lost and replaced by a much impoverished view of religion. And finally, I will suggest that Thomas's account could help those of us who want to be both faithful to our home traditions and to pursue interreligious inquiry. Religion, Thomas says, is a potential part of justice. It can be considered under justice, since by its acts it renders to God what is due to God. It can only be considered potential, since the human person is never fully able to pay this debt. There is no act of worship deep enough, broad enough, worthy enough to pay back to God what is due to God. Much like there is no act of gratitude on the part of children extensive enough to pay back their debts to their parents, much as they would like to think otherwise. We are by nature in a situation of indebtedness, and religious practice is our means of acknowledging the debt and, so to speak, paying what interest we can. Religion has the aspect of virtue because it is an operative habit that makes both the act and the person performing the act good. To render anyone her due is an aspect of the good, since by giving someone what properly belongs to her, one becomes more properly ordered to her. A certain good is brought about by the right ordering of relationships. By worshiping God, however, we do not add to God's glory or make God grander than God already is. We worship God not because it will change God, but because it will change us. So becoming religious, much like becoming more temperate or more courageous, changes us, transforms us, and orders us more properly to God. Religion is an infused moral virtue, grounded in grace and guided by the theological virtues. Becoming religious doesn't change us like gaining knowledge does, since its acts arise from the will, not from reason. Since it deals with acts directed toward the worship of God, not God himself, however, becoming religious doesn't change us like becoming faithful does either. Acts of religion are choices that are made about what is appropriate for the worship of God. Thus, religion does not reach out to God as faith reaches out to God when we believe. In other words, God is not the object of religion as God is the object of faith. Rather, God is the end of religion. God is the purpose of religion. The individual or social actions are the acts and objects of religion. Therefore, when we worship through communal adoration or private prayer, we do so as a result of religion as a virtue. Religion then does not substitute for faith, but to be true religion, it has to be grounded in true faith. Religion is comprehensive in that it commands the acts of all the virtues and human activities insofar as they are related to the honor of God. Religion can be pagan or Christian, private or social, as long as it directs one to the service and reverence of God. The acts of religion are so meant to take root and change the believer that religion differs from sanctity only by the way that we examine it, not essentially. Religion honors God in ways that refer particularly to divine worship, such as sacrifice and oblations. So one is certainly sanctified by particular acts of worship, but becoming sanctified in other ways renders one more able to worship well. Consequently, acts of worship and other acts of sanctification mutually strengthen each other. Now, to conclude our brief foray into Thomas on religion, we note that religion implies becoming habituated in a relationship to God. I cite Thomas. It's such a beautiful quote. I love this. I love to cite Thomas on this. Okay. So listen carefully. For it is he to whom we ought to be bound as our unfailing principle, to whom also our choice should be resolutely directed as to our last end, and whom we lose when we neglect by sin, and should recover by believing him and confessing our faith. For Thomas, then, religion is an aspect of the human person. It is a moral virtue that is meant to take root in the person and turn her more radically toward God. Religion is a widely embracing term, but it makes no sense for Thomas to speak of one religion among others. He cites from authorities as Cicero for his discussion of religion as a virtue. making religion an expansive term to cover that which renders service and reverence to God. In the Summa Contra Gentiles, Thomas argues that religion is necessary because it allows the human person to reach beyond the goods of this life, citing Thomas again. Wherefore, since man is directed by divine providence to a higher good than human frailty can attain in the present life, it was necessary for his mind to be bidden to something higher than those things to which our reason can reach in the present life, so that he might learn to aspire, and by his endeavors to tend to something surpassing the whole state of the present life. Just like the philosophers urged people away from sensible pleasures and toward virtues, Christian religion urges people away from temporal matters and promises spiritual and eternal goods. This is the next section of these reflections. Several scholars have tracked the sea change that occurred between Thomas's understanding of religion and our own, and I'm sure you're familiar with these. One can turn to Wilfred Cantwell Smith, Michael Buckley, Nicholas Lash, Charles Taylor, among many others, to track this change. Over the centuries, writes Buckley, religion shifted from the medieval's virtue that dictated the ways in which human beings worship and interrelate with God to denote particular beliefs, myths, practices, and symbols indicative of the character of human culture. Both religion and God became a subset of human culture as well as its symptomatic product. The appropriate form of inquiry into religion was increasingly found in anthropology, ethnology, psychology, or sociology. Religion became another way of bracketing the religious. Nicholas Lash tracks this sea change through the development of our understanding of the term God. Quote, as the word has now come to be the name of the members of a class of actual or possible things or entities of a particular kind, a kind that some people call divine and others supernatural. If this is what gods have now become, then Christians, Jews, and Muslims share with atheists a disbelief in gods, for none believe such things exist. Before modernity, God stood for whatever it was that people worshipped. It was a relational term, like treasure. By the end of the 18th century, the word God came to be used for the first time to name the ultimate explanation of the system of the world. The operable scholarly terms used to examine religion meant that the data of religious communal living, centered upon acts of worship and reverence, were completely excluded. The turn to an incessant search for origins of religion and the Enlightenment climaxed with the origin tales of Feuerbach, Marx, and Freud, thus furthering any sense of the religious from religion. Buckley concludes his second book on atheism on an incisive note, and I quote, one will not long believe in a personal God with whom there is no personal communication, and the most compelling evidence of a personal God must itself be personal. To attempt something else as foundation or as substitute, as has been done so often in an effort to shore up the assertion of God, is to move into a process of internal contradictions, of which the ultimate resolution must be atheism. Now, the loss of considering religion as a moral virtue that is related to justice, and turning it into a subset of culture, with its concomitant incessant search for origins in the Enlightenment, means that when attempting to pursue interreligious dialogue, we compare different things, rather than the different worshiping communities. But what if we were to return to Thomas's account of the religious, and recognize that Jews, Christians, and Muslims at least, fall squarely in the center of what it means to be religious? Understanding religion as worship could provide the starting point for interreligious conversation in new, constructive ways. We can turn to conciliar documents for the launching pad for this project. Nostra Aetate asks Catholics to enter into dialogue and collaboration with other religious believers in order to preserve and promote the good things, spiritual as well as moral, as well as the socio-cultural values found among these men. With respect to Muslims in particular, the document affirms, and I quote, they adore the one God living and subsisting in himself, merciful and all-powerful, the creator of heaven and earth, who has spoken to men. They take pains to submit wholeheartedly to even his inscrutable degrees, just as Abraham, with whom the faith of Islam takes pleasure in linking itself, submitted to God. Though they do not acknowledge Jesus as God, they revere him as a prophet. They also honor Mary, Virgin Mother. At times, they even call on her with devotion. In addition, they await the day of judgment when God will render their deserts to all those who have been raised up from the dead. Finally, they value the moral life and worship God, especially through prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. Lumen Gentium is even more emphatic about the fact that Muslims and Christians honor the same God. But the plan of salvation also, I'm quoting from Lumen Gentium here, sorry. But the plan of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator. In the first place among these are the Muslims, who, professing to hold the faith of Abraham along with us, adore the one and merciful God, who on the last day will judge mankind. And we have to recognize, of course, that we find no mention of Muhammad in the otherwise praiseworthy comments made about Muslims and their faith in these groundbreaking conciliar documents. They give no sense that this faith has a founder and a history. But they do affirm that Muslims and Christians adore the one Creator God. Daniel Madigan pointedly notes that we cannot say that we adore one and the same God together, and then say that we cannot or may not talk together about that God, or about the sense of adoration that God evokes in us. Through this conciliar lens, then, if we turn back to Thomas and ask what distinguishes idolaters from truly religious people, we find Muslims standing alongside Christians. Thomas writes, "The word latria can be taken in two senses. In one sense, it can signify the human actions which pertain to the worship of God. And in this way, latria has the same meaning no matter to whom it is given, because the one to whom worship is given is not included in the definition. And in this way, latria is predicated univocally of true religio and of idolatry. But in another sense, latria is identical in meaning with religio. And in this sense, since religio is a virtue, it is essential to it that it be given only to the one to whom it is due. And so in the second sense, latria is predicated equivocally of true religion and of idolatry." The conciliar fathers recognized that Muslims, quote, adore the one God, living and subsisting in himself, merciful and all-powerful, the creator of heaven and earth, who has spoken to men. So they, alongside Jews and Christians, can be considered truly religious. I turn finally to a test case that I haven't fully thought out, but I think it's important. John Paul II's prayer for peace at Assisi in 1986, which at first I was somewhat uncomfortable with, but now I've come around. We know he was widely criticized for this interreligious prayer service. We also remember that Benedict XVI, when traveling to Assisi in 2011 for an ecumenical discussion to commemorate the 1986 meeting, chose not to hold an interdenominational prayer service, since the Church should not give the impression, even externally interpreted by others, that theological differences have been reduced or are not consequential. He chose instead to call a meeting that ended with a silent time for personal meditation. Both popes were criticized for these events. During the first prayer service, John Paul II was not shy about affirming that, quote, peace bears the name of Jesus Christ, and that, quote, the form and content of our prayers are very different, as we have seen, and there can be no question of reducing them to a kind of common denominator. I remember having my own reservations about this prayer for peace, but I now think that praying together in limited and qualified ways, I'm not talking about sharing the Eucharistic table, puts at the center what has for so long been sidelined in discussions of religious differences, worship. It has to be carefully and respectfully done, but it would complement the conference table approach and remind us that worship originally was a relational term. I suggest to you today that returning to Thomas Aquinas' sense of religio as worship and thinking through what interreligious worship could mean could fruitfully enhance interreligious inquiry. Thank you.
All right, well, we have about a little more than 10 minutes for questions, so I open it up to questions.
I have a question for Flannery. I've read some parts of Rawls, and he seems to say that his part of the conception of justice is not, justice in the ordinary sense, and that this is a special part of justice for lawmaking and other things. And I thought the beautiful part of thinking of justice as a virtue is that it is personal, and thus that general justice and particular justice, if you will, can be related in some way. And this is, I think, a deficiency in Rawls. And I thought I found this kind of explicitly in Aristotle, although I couldn't find a place in it now because I was busy listening. But it seems to me as if you want to push the distinction between a general justice and a particular justice, saying that they are different species of the same genus. But it seems to me as if, well, it would be interesting to hear about the relation between the two, and if you think that an increase in the disposition of general justice would also point towards an increase in the disposition of particular justice, or the other way around. Because it seems to me this is a feature of Aristotle. And that to me seemed to be the beautiful part of thinking of justice specifically as a virtue. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much for the question. Well, first of all, I think, and I think that you think as well, that we do find in in Aristotle, an appreciation for individual justice. And in fact, the title of this conference having to do with the crowning glory of the virtues, apparently it is from Cicero, but it's not unrelated to something that Aristotle says in I think it's the first chapter of the fifth book. But in any case, he talks about the relationship between the two, but the direction is very much from particular justice towards general justice, and he acknowledges that justice is a particular virtue, but that it comes to perfection, uses that word perfection, in general justice precisely because it's oriented towards the general good, the common good, and he makes this remark about, he says, well, it's quite possible for someone to be just personally with his own goods and his own possessions, etc., in his own family, but that it really is, he proves his own justice when he becomes a politician. So precisely with legal justice or general justice. But certainly there's no sort of denial that particular justice is important, and I think many of the things that Professor Porter was talking about had to do with particular justice.
Question, Mr. Moreland. You talk about going back to this understanding of religion and Aquinas that habituates us to God, and being able to really apply it to interreligious career. It seems to me that at stake is really how we understand who God is. And it seems that it matters who Jesus is. For in the case of, you mentioned Islam and Christianity. So it seems like there's really a tension in that interreligious dialogue, that maybe you were uncomfortable with the prayer of John Paul II. So I'm just wondering how would you really resolve that tension? Because in order to be really habituated toward God and being able to dialogue about these things, it matters how we understand who God is. So that's a really good question.
So I'll say first that I think that the tension present in interreligious prayer is important. It's important to recognize and maintain. And it is what I think when I've been around interreligious academic conversations in conference situations, it's ignored in a more profound way and sidelined in a more profound way, that if we if we met around a place that's more intimate to each of our traditions and more sort of central to who we are. The differences are absolutely there, but we're talking from the heart of things more than we are around an academic seminar table with no symbols, white to anything. And when we're, I think, kind of pretending to leave those differences behind in some important ways. So I don't think that coming together as worshipers means that we ignore differences. In some ways it means that we highlight the differences, and that's important.
Randy?
Yeah. Kevin, could you describe, because you didn't have really time, how we get from, and maybe a little bit about the debate, how we get from corrective justice in Aristotle to commutative justice in Aquinas, because they don't seem exactly the same.
That's
I'll
right,
speak to
yeah,
that.
and that's, this is one of the textual problems. Well, I mean, if you take a look at the beginning of the fourth chapter of the fifth book, he introduces the question of reciprocal relationships and reciprocity. Sorry, a bit jet lag. The words aren't coming. And then immediately afterwards, he talks about corrective justice and also distributive justice. I read it, and in fact, Thomas reads it as if he is using corrective justice in order to answer that question about reciprocity. And Thomas thinks that reciprocity is simply about commutative relations, and so that's basically how he does it. But another point which is important is that in the translations that Thomas was using, he never found anything like corrective justice. I mean, in fact, all the translations that he was using, there were about three available at the time. They all talked about directive justice, so he would have been led to believe that in fact directive justice is talked about later when he's talking about when Thomas interprets him as talking about corrective justice. So part of it has to do with his translations, but then there's a further question about why did the translators who obviously all knew Greek, why did they translate a word which is clearly ought to be translated a corrective justice as directive justice, and I think that they had a similar idea, is that the fourth and the fifth chapters of the fifth book do deal with one thing which is related to simply reciprocity, which is simply about exchanges and not necessarily about correcting anything. It's just about correcting. In fact, in the paper, one of the points I make is that when you talk about corrective justice, I mean, Thomas might actually even accept that term, but emphasize not the correction, but the correct. That is, so at the heart of it would simply be correct exchanges, and which sometimes have to be corrected. But the basic idea is that there's a certain justice which simply has to do with reciprocity, and if all is well, then you have a correct relationship that is justice, and if it needs to be corrected, well, then you have corrective justice. So that's how I do it in the paper.
Yes.
I am pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Kalamazoo, Michigan. I find myself to be a bit of an anomaly here, in being non-Catholic, and I am intrigued, Anna, by your interest in using worship as a way to bring us together in conversation with people who perhaps have different perspectives and experiences of a longing for God. I am intrigued by the question earlier as well about what might we need to leave behind, at what cost could we pursue this. My experience in these couple of days has been indeed one of trying not to think about what I'm leaving behind, but out of what common basis do we both have, do all of us have, for affirming something together. I think this is an inherent tension when we talk about worship, indeed, when the communion table is not open to all. And it is an inherent tension that, of course, is then latent as well within any conversation that we might have about ethical perspectives. I'm intrigued by your appeal to Aquinas, as he is, of course, a common figure in our shared heritage. And I don't really know what my question is exactly, except that I'm intrigued by this longing that I think that you put your finger on it, at least, that I think must be developed in the end in some way if the purpose of this center and if the purpose of all of us as Christians is indeed to be pursued to its fullest extent in the faithful witness to Jesus Christ, that we must pursue this in some way together. So maybe my question is something about rather than seeing this as a cost that we must leave behind in our common worship, is there some way in which we might appeal to what we share in common and indeed accentuate both experiences of worship and ethical conversation by consequence as a way to indeed come back together in opposition to what Brad Gregory said last time?
Thank you. I think perhaps a good model for what I'm thinking about, even if it doesn't really have to do with worship, is the practice of scriptural reasoning, with Jews, Christians, and Muslims coming together in temporary tents of meeting and reading scriptures together on a particular theme or story. It's not centered on worship, but actually in those weekends involve like at least music and dancing, really, from different traditions. And it's just something more that is exchanged there that I've just found lacking in other more academic conversations.
All right, well, please join me in thanking our speakers.